My next speaker, Julian Phillips, is Senior Vice President and Managing Director of XTJ, the AVI SBL's global business unit, which specializes in delivering experience technology solutions. They offer deep technology expertise and global implementation capability in partnership with a lot of the world's leading architects, experience design firms, fabricators, content producers, and manufacturers. This is all about bringing together space, content, and technology to create truly integrated experiences. Julian, please join us on stage. Thank you.
I know what you're thinking. Who comes to a conference with a title of his presentation that says, for the next 18 minutes, try to imagine this? What is it I am asking you to imagine? Well, let's go with this. I want you to imagine that a giant electromagnetic pulse has impacted the world and instantaneously wiped out all collective knowledge, understanding of how to design, how to build, operate, and manage the workplace as we used to know it. And not just the workplace itself, but actually the way that we work. And in that one stroke, the whole world, at the same time, stared at each other and said, what are we going to do now? Sounds a bit ridiculous and far-fetched, doesn't it? I'm asking you to imagine. Anyone seen the movie Yesterday? Happened with the Beatles. So a giant EMP comes down, wipes out all knowledge of the Beatles, and only 3 people in the world know anything about Beatles songs. This guy becomes a hero. He starts singing Beatles songs, and everyone thinks he's a genius. You're still not imagining, are you? Why? Well, the reason is we find it very, very difficult to imagine a future that is yet to be played out. We find it a lot easier to relate to things that have already happened and put those into context, and that effectively is what we know as experience. We build our experiences by relating new events or events around us, and we relate them back to things that have happened. So I'm going to ask you to do this. Can you think of a singular event that has actually happened, that the whole world experienced all at the same time, that collectively changed everything as we know it moving forward? Of course we do. That's what the title is saying up there right now. But here's where I want to take us with this little journey. I think that's the wrong title, the post-pandemic workplace, because the one thing that we actually did learn throughout the pandemic, and if you imagine that EMP, is that singular event was so dramatic and unforeseen. Some people will tell you we saw it coming, but it was so unforeseen that the one thing that we should always now know is that what is the next giant event that could actually throw us again into that kind of chaos. And you're saying, oh, come on, we've just got over the pandemic. But I actually want to challenge you with this. In exactly the same way as we're now finding our feet coming back from the pandemic, look at what's happening in the world. Geopolitical strife, not very far away from here. Who imagined that we would potentially have war back in Europe? If you think about climate change, that is something that is not going away. We have new challenges ahead of us for climate change. And this so-called just-in-time, globally integrated supply chain, we're beginning to discover that that particular story is not playing out the way we thought it is. So I don't think we're actually talking about a post-pandemic workplace or work. I actually think we need to be preparing ourselves for work in a whole brand new world. Now that becomes very challenging because it means that we now have to switch off our processing brains, the bits of our brain that feeds lots of data and processes and analyzes, and we now need to switch on our creative side of our brains. Because what has gone before might not serve us in this new order moving forward. I mean, the one thing that happened to me during this amazing thing is I forgot how to use PowerPoint. Now, there's a reason why you don't see PowerPoint slides here, because I don't want you reading PowerPoint slides and processing and trying to figure out what I'm saying. I want you to switch on your creative brains and start thinking. Are you with me so far? Okay, right. What did we learn during the pandemic? Well, I mentioned that whole thing about prepare for the next thing. But what we also learned, basically, we gathered information through experience, so real-time experience, and also lots of anecdotes. So let's just dig into that a little bit. What we found is that literally on the stroke of whenever it was, March 25th, whenever it was, we all left our offices and went home, is that everybody managed to work with the tools that they actually had, and pretty quickly it occurred. No one trained everybody in the event that we were going to have to live in this pandemic world. Everyone used the tools that they had and very, very quickly adapted to these tools, whether it be Zoom, whether it be Microsoft Teams, whatever it is, people managed to adapt. They also adapted a whole range of other things, not just using technology. They adapted the way they thought about work. They started to realize that actually not commuting into the office actually had lots of benefits. You all had benefits from that. As a direct result of that, a whole range of other subsequent consequences happened. The Great Resignation. A lot of people actually started to reevaluate, why am I commuting all this time into work? What is work anyway? Do I really need to do this? This is a significant challenge that is not only happening during the pandemic, it's something that's going to carry forward too. So what we've actually learned through that whole process is that people are infinitely more adaptable than organizations, than buildings, than processes, than all the things that we've spent the last 30, 40 years designing and building and constructing to be these robust, amazing things that can withstand anything. Well, guess what? It couldn't. People are infinitely more adaptable than any of that. And so as we are working our way forward, we need to remember that one single principle. Now, because I'm telling a story, let's just go into the anatomy of a story right now. So, you know, we talked about a disaster movie. What does every disaster movie have? Well, it has the disaster itself. We've just talked about that. And we've all had that experience of the disaster of the pandemic. And many of us have been affected by that, not only in our businesses, financially, but personally, through loved ones that we know that have been affected. But so many other aspects of business and life as we know it have been affected. So the disaster has impacted everybody. And if you think about it, it's the single event that has actually happened only in the history of mankind where the whole world experienced something all at the same time in the same context. Now that experiment itself, we'll call it an experiment, but that experience has meant that people's mentalities and their ideas about what actually happened in that survival of that moment is never going to go away. There are learnt behaviors and there are instincts that people now have that they didn't have beforehand. So there was the disaster. Now, if you remember all the other disaster movies you've seen, when you have the disaster, you then have the struggle. The struggle is when you actually now figure out, okay, we've had the disaster, we've got back on our feet, and now we need to try and defeat that particular disaster that's actually happened. So what was the struggle that we went through in the workplace? Well, I think it was this. We struggled because we had this concept that we were actually going to go back to the office. The struggle was, if you remember, okay, we're now actually going to, with vaccines that are actually coming on board, we're now going to start planning our return to office strategies. Little show of hands, how many of you in the room had return to office strategies when you were actually deciding what percentage of people would go back over what date period and what terms they did with 6 feet of separation and all that kind of stuff? Show of hands, you all had return to office strategies. Okay, how many of them worked? Hands up for the return to office strategies that worked out exactly as you planned them. No, they didn't. And there's a whole range of reasons why that was. And it wasn't just that we had Delta and that we actually had Omicron and various different variants. That certainly affected the push out. I would argue that the reason it actually didn't work is we were still thinking about the old concepts that we had in the office. And we were trying to shoehorn these people that had experienced a whole new thing back into that concept of the original office design. I'll give you some examples of what happened. So remember the disaster when we all jumped on our laptops and we did Zoom or MS Teams or whatever. It was pretty simple, wasn't it? You just switch on your computer, you start the app, you click a button, and there you are, full framed, head, shoulders, beautiful video. Well, not in my case, but the rest of you, you're all beautiful people, beautifully framed in a box on the screen, and everyone else on the screen was looking exactly the same. And we actually started to see this level of community. People were starting to storytell again. You remember the Zoom parties you used to have with your work colleagues and your family and friends you probably didn't see for many years? You know, this whole thing about we didn't get to see each people. We probably saw more people during the pandemic on video than we did in real life. But the problem is, when we went back to the office, what we found is that experience we had when we were working from home didn't actually work when we went back into the conference room and actually tried to press a button and everyone was full frame video. It didn't work that way. Why? Well, it wasn't because we designed things badly in the first time around. We designed it from a totally different starting point. And that was that conference rooms are an extension of our normal traditional work pattern, where we have traditional meetings that we basically put people into a box with a table in the middle of the room, and everyone is a pinhead in the room with variable degrees of audio quality. It wasn't actually designed to provide this thing that we now know as meeting equity. And what we started to find was that people, through the return to office strategies, were coming back into the office, trying to do a video call because they now had 20 video calls a day, going into the conference room, and it didn't work the way that they wanted it to work. So they went home again. So there's so many different experiences that we've actually had in this return to office. I would argue that it's not a failure of technology, that's not a failure of anything other than the fact that we designed the office in a way that suited our purposes, and it's not going to suit our purposes moving forward. So as we went through the struggle, and there are many other examples of that, we started to learn through observation that people have already adapted, these infinitely adaptable people, to ways and behaviors, not only using technology, but how they actually meet and the way that they actually meet as well, that we need to now think about when we're thinking about what we do for the future. And I'll provide you another example. One of the things that actually happened is that people meet for a shorter time period. Do you remember that time where you used to book a meeting when you're in the office and the default was, it's an hour, guys, it's an hour. I book a meeting, it's an hour. You spend the first 5 or 10 minutes waiting for people to turn up. You spend the next 10 minutes trying to fiddle around to get the technology to work or whatever. Everyone chats about the football or whatever happened at the weekend. You get into the meeting, you go through the minutes of the previous meeting. No one makes a decision. You get to the end of the meeting and agree you're going to have a meeting the following week because you didn't achieve anything in that meeting. Does that sound familiar? Okay. What people found during the pandemic is that actually they were having 30-minute meetings because they were much more prepared, because they had access to the information they need, and they were much more purposeful in the way that they were actually conducting their meetings. And they actually started to get a better balance. So when we're thinking about the future, we now need to think that it's not just the building, it is not just the technology, it is actually the meeting itself and the way we're actually collaborating that's fundamentally changing. So there's the struggle. So where are we going in the future? Well, like every great story, there has to be a triumph. This is the way Hollywood works. So we've had our disaster, we've had our struggle, but what about the triumph? Well, I believe that the triumph is actually going to be us creating and designing this future, not for the post-pandemic, but actually for the new world order that we see ahead of us. And all the evidence we actually have right now is that there is no rule book. There is no one actually saying, this is the way you are going to have to design. Doesn't matter what any of my colleagues say to you in this conference right now. There is no one blueprint that you can actually say that I can copy that and I'm going to use it in my business, and that's the way it's actually going to work. Because what we're finding is that most organizations are realizing that what really matters is their brand of who they are as an organization, It is about how they relate to their customers, depending on the market that they're in. It's definitely about their people and how they not only engage their people, but how they actually retain them because of the Great Resignation, and also attract amazing new talent. And what we're seeing is that most organizations are creating that future, or starting to create that future, in their own way, and actually starting to be a lot more creative than they've ever been before. But there lies the challenge. As I mentioned right at the beginning, we tend to form our experiences based on what we relate to from the past. And I believe that one of the biggest challenges that every single one of you have in this room right now, moving forward, is that you're still too wedded to the old way of doing things. And it's a very, very difficult challenge, but I'm seeing it very much if you think about work, and I think one of the biggest significant changes we're seeing is a shift from what we've known in workplace as synchronous work. In other words, everybody goes into one single place at one single time, and the way that they connect is they're all present at the same time doing that. There is a significant shift, and we've seen this accelerate during the pandemic, to the move to asynchronous work. In other words, you not only have people working in different locations collectively together, but they're actually working on bits of the work independently of each other and then bringing that together in little moments of collaboration. And what we're also seeing, it's not only people and place and time that's playing here, we've now got the rise of the digital agent. And what I mean by that is we're starting to see the rise of artificial intelligence and automation now playing a significant role in the way that we're designing work. And so when we're thinking about designing for the future, it's not just about how do we make a building smart, and by the way, I do believe our buildings should be a lot smarter than they've been in the past. It's how do we actually get smart work, and how do we actually use a lot of the technology we have, which is not just about video and meetings. It's actually how do we get automation and AI into the process that enables us to work in ways we've never done before, and unlock a period of productivity that we've never seen in modern times. And if you think this is science fiction, any of you Microsoft Teams users in the room? You're very shy, because statistically about 85% of you are Microsoft Teams users. There you go. But you might remember this morning you might have got an email from Microsoft Viva. She's a lovely lady. And she reminds me every single morning of the meetings I'm just about to have, but not only that, about the documents that I might need that are relevant for that particular meeting, and actually reminds me of the task that I said I was going to do that I didn't do. This is now the rise of AI. And it's starting to play a significant role in the way we think about productivity moving forward. So, I did promise I was going to finish at 12:30 because I'm between you and a well-earned coffee break. So, I am going to make one plea to every single one of you in the room right now. The future is about what you create. It is how you experiment. It is how you actually break the norms of what has gone before and design for how this world should be. Not necessarily the way it could be, but the way the world should be, and not just as an adaptation of the way it's been in the past. If you embrace that and constantly remember that for every new thing you do, get rid of an old thing, because we tend to hang on to old things, and that's holding us back. So for every new thing you do, get rid of an old thing. Become an explorer, not a copier, not a follower, and I think the world will be in a much better place. Have a wonderful cup of coffee. Thank you.